This is Next Radio.
With Broadcast Bionics, innovative solutions for creative people.
Thank you very much. You're too kind. So mobile phones. Mobile phones are supposed to be the future, aren't they? When you look at how people tune into the radio, we're told by many people who run the radio industry that mobile phones are the future thing that everybody will be using to tune into the radio. I thought I'd have a quick look into that. I'm going to talk about how mobile phones are being used for radio right now. I'm going to talk about why mobile phones are important to radio's future. And I'm going to make an observation at the end as well. But firstly, just let me tell you a bit about myself. For those of you who don't know, I used to be a radio presenter a long, long time ago. That's me, looking young and slightly scared. Top left is Chris Moyles. I don't know what's happened to him now. But still. Then I worked for a radio station called Virgin Radio in London, which of course is now Absolute Radio. I ran the website and various other things there. And in 2005, I launched the world's first 3G tuner, as we called it, rather entertainingly. That name didn't catch on, but the idea of radio apps certainly has. Then I worked for the BBC, looked after, among other things, how the iPlayer worked for radio. And including a better mobile experience as well. Now I run my own mobile website and work for a bunch of great companies, including the Radio Player, who have a top-rated app on iOS, Android, and the Kindle Fire, and of course, as you've seen earlier, more to come. So I've been working with radio and new technology for 24 years now. But one thing that surprised me is the lack of information that we actually have about smartphone apps for radio. If you ask any broadcaster what kind of numbers they're getting, they'll probably tell you some download figures, but probably that's it. And really, we don't know very much information about how our apps are being used, or at least, even if we do, no radio company wants to tell anybody about it. So I've talked to a bunch of companies to find out a little bit more. Those that I could name include All In Media and JCaps and Spodtronic and Screech. They're companies who are based not just in the UK, but also Australia, in the US, and in Europe. I've also spoken to broadcasters and app manufacturers on a more private level as well as sifted through lots of public information, because there is quite a lot about mobile apps. So I've done most of my research here in the UK, but obviously you'll also hear stuff from Europe, North America, and Australia in here too. So just before I tell you how people are actually using radio on mobile phones, let me just define what I mean by radio here. Radio is a linear stream that people tune into that has some kind of human interaction in it. So Pandora, for example, or Alpeo if you're from Germany, or a Songel if you're from Australia, is not radio. Radio is things like Radio 1 and Capital FM and that kind of thing. So that's one definition. Here's another definition. This is a definition of mobile, and this is a handy definition from the BBC's Tomorrow's World programme in 1979.
At the moment in the UK, approved mobile phones are really little more than transmitter receivers which put the caller in touch with a post office operator who dials up the number you want and then connects your remote radio extension with the rest of the telephone network.
So I hope that's clear. So, who listens to radio on a mobile phone, and how do they listen to it? Well, the first thing is, actually broadcast radio inside mobile phones is pretty big. This was the San Francisco Chronicle a couple of years ago when I was there, and they had a special feature on tuning into smartphones with FM radio, which I quite liked. In 2010, we see that 53% of listeners to radio on their mobile phones used FM on their mobile phone, and only 16% at that time ran a branded app. I think that's interesting. I think that figure has also changed as well, but I think that FM is certainly really interesting. FM is also particularly interesting once you start looking outside of the UK and outside of North America. Let's have a look at this video from India. who knew? Nokia advertising the future of radio. Nokia, of course, as we all know, is the world's largest radio manufacturer because of the amount of radios that they have in their device. You can't even make a Microsoft Windows phone without an FM radio in it, which I think is fairly amazing. In Mumbai, this is an amazing stat, 94% of listeners tune into radio on their mobile phone. Only 16% tune in on a radio receiver. Isn't that an amazing figure? Amazing. Just goes to show how different radio is consumed in different countries in the world. But let's go to America. This is an app with an amusing name. I think we came up with Next Radio first, but nevertheless, we'll let them have this. This is an app which has just come out in the US. It's called Next Radio. What's lovely about it is this is an FM tuner that gets additional information over the internet. So an FM tuner that gets more information over the internet, such as song information and artwork and all that kind of stuff. You might think to yourself, isn't that what Radio DNS was supposed to do? Guess what? This has got Radio DNS running in it under the hood. And if you bring the Next Radio app to the UK, you'll still see some of this really nice, smart information. This is now available on Google Play for about 3 different phones and pre-installed on Sprint. It's a great start for a hybrid radio future. Here's a pie chart. Thanks very much. This is showing Absolute Radio and the amount of downloads that their apps are currently getting. This was for Q2 of this year. You can see that iOS is still getting the majority of downloads from stupid people. Android getting about 31%. And actually, that's because Android, some of the devices are very cheap and very low level and probably can't cope very well with this kind of thing. BlackBerry is at 11%, and the other two are Windows Mobile and Nokia phones in there as well. Quite a lot of installations there, nearly 250,000 in that quarter. Usage is very interesting. Once you start having a look at Apple versus Android, in the US, they're seeing similar usage patterns in terms of people using those apps, but Android is delivering more audience. Apple is delivering more time. In fact, Apple delivers up to twice as much time on average as Android, possibly because if you have a Apple phone, you are more likely, statistically, to be in an office where you've got free, abundant Wi-Fi and you can actually sit at a desk, whereas Android, because they cover the entire spectrum of cheap to expensive, can be in other places as well. So how long are people tuning in? This is the really important thing. This is just a control figure. This is what Radar tells us is the amount of people, is the amount of time that people spend listening to the radio, 3 hours a day. So bear that in mind when we have a look at these figures, which are the average listening duration for streaming radio apps. We're not comparing like with like here. We're comparing the average duration of me going to an app and turning it on. I spoke to one company and they said the average is 12 minutes, 46 seconds. Spoke to another company and they said that their average was between 12 and 16 minutes. And the third company said quite a lot more, but basically average durations everywhere from 14 to 45. What I didn't clarify with them is that an average duration over a week or is that an average duration over a session? But you can see that these figures are quite low. You can also compare that with things like O2, who released a press release last year showing what people do on their phones, 15 minutes of listening to music a day. Probably coincides quite nicely with the 12 to 14 minutes that we've just seen on that previous slide. How many times are they doing that per week? Well, that's important too. Again, we can go to Absolute Radio because they're wonderfully open and free with their data. And we can see that in July, they had 232 active users to their apps and just over 1 million app sessions per month, which means that most people who use the Absolute Radio app used it once a week, which, of course, is 15 minutes or 12 minutes or 30 minutes a week. So we're not talking about huge figures in terms of tuning into radio through streaming mobiles just yet. Portable radio. There's some audio here, which is marvelous audio, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. Portable radio is a wonderful thing, and of course we here in the UK
was once a man who didn't mind missing buses. One glance at the wireless program, then he tuned in with his straw headset, singing in the rain, as it were. This particular model, dated 1931, became rather monotonous until father invented this patent pram complete with aerials. The baby listens contentedly to the wireless lullaby.
Scary baby. Well, so where are people tuning into radio? Is the mobile phone called the mobile phone for a reason? It's interesting when you go to Germany and you notice what they call mobile phones. They don't call them mobile phones, they call them handies. And I think calling something a handy is quite interesting because they are handy. You do have them with you at all times. They aren't necessarily mobile. When you have a look at the figures, the stats for how people are tuning into radio over smartphone apps, then this is a really interesting figure. 70 to 75% of all listening requests are done over Wi-Fi. So actually what we're seeing is people aren't using their mobile phones while they are mobile to listen to the radio. They're actually more likely to be either at home or in the office. A couple more interesting pieces of information. Firstly, the best day for downloading them is Sunday. So if you're going to talk up your apps, talk them up on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Don't bother with us with the rest of the week because we don't care. So that's good. Here's what people do with their apps, according to one of the companies I spoke to. You'll notice that nearly 30% of them, the first thing they do is they hit the play in background button, so that they get rid of the damn thing. But you can also see things like sponsors and ads doing suspiciously well. And other things such as links to Twitter and Facebook and podcasts and so on. Do radio apps increase audience figures? I think the answer isn't as easy as saying yes or no here. Very clearly, if you have your station logo on your homepage, that is going to increase any brand recall that you have. So if you use RayJar, as we do in the UK, for diaries, then I think that should have a good effect. If you just install the app, you never use it, but every time you turn your phone on, you see that capital FM logo or whatever it happens to be. Listening is mostly done on headphones. Not great for countries who use electronic measurement, and Edison Research have just published some figures which show that 75% of at-work listening is done through headphones. Not sure I believe it, but it's a tremendously high figure. People who find your radio station through places like Radio Player, through TuneIn, and all of the other ways that you can find radio, those I think are the people you need to impress. Because those are people who haven't downloaded your app. They're probably not your P1 listeners, your most popular listeners. But you don't control the brand experience there, with the exception of Radio Player. It's one of the reasons why I think the Radio Player is really important here, because you do control what the audience sees in Radio Player there. It doesn't happen in TuneIn and any of the other things. So the people who download your app are already converted to your radio station. So, in my remaining 4 minutes, why are mobiles important? Here's why mobiles are important. This is showing you the amount of people, the amount of hours listened per week in Europe to radio. And you can see that in almost every territory, apart from the crazy Dutch, young people are tuning into radio less. So that's important when you then have a look at this graph. This is showing the amount of people who say that they've ever listened to radio via a mobile phone. Not sure how useful that figure is, but at least we're seeing that increasing quite nicely over the last 3 years or so for all adults. But then when you have a look at younger audiences, you can see very clearly that this is definitely a young audience thing. That's why mobiles are really important to radio as a way of finding new radio stations from there. I'll leave you with one observation. And it's a very simple observation. It's probably an observation that we might wish to talk about on a blog or on a discussion posting at some point. But it occurred to me when I was putting this together the other day. The mobile phone is really lean forward. You're always pressing buttons on it, and this goes for tablets as well. You're always pressing buttons on it. You're always doing things with it. You're always expecting it to do other things. Music radio, today's best music and all of that stuff, is the least lean forward medium. It's specifically designed to do that. The user interface for radio is great. You press one button, it plays you stuff. And then when you've had enough, you press another button and it stops. That's how music radio works. So we've got the most lean forward experience and the least lean forward experience. I just wonder whether linear radio is the right experience for mobile, or whether we should be delivering something better. What's better? Up for us to work out. But thank you for your time. I hope that was interesting. Thanks.
I thought it was very interesting, especially interesting that maybe people aren't listening on their mobiles as much as we think that they are, or that they're not using them in the way that we think that they are.
I knew that today. I've been to the Next Radio before, and you know that it's always going to be a mixture of graphs and presentation and creative thinking, and I like all those things. I love the graphs.
Certainly, still make me go back and check out radio station websites and apps to make sure they are as switched on as they could be.
This is Next Radio.
Was broadcast by Onyx. Innovative solutions for creative people.